we are continuing where we left off. That is, we are now going to deal with part 3 of the essay, titled Dany's Struggle with Herself. Here's a reminder for you. I did not receive permission to dialecticide Tymirine's blood, so instead I paraphrase the parts I discuss and say exactly which ones I'm responding to. As such, the only way for you to comprehend this video is to read these essays and preferably have them in a separate browser tab so that you can read the relevant passages. Again, it's probably not the kind of video you can listen to while doing household chores. And of course, you should first watch part 1. Before we start, remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video. This part starts with Adam Feldman quoting the famous Faulkner utterance about the human heart in the conflict with itself. When seen through this lens, Dany's arc is precisely about that. About the choices she has to make in between what she wants and what is right, and what she is willing to give up to achieve it. And most crucially, whether she would rather sacrifice a lot for the peace or turn towards her darker impulses instead, and that what Dany chooses will inevitably have consequences for Westeros. Read From the Human Heart to Consequences for Westeros. I agree with everything said here up to the very last sentence of this paragraph. And the outcome of this struggle will have momentous consequences for Westeros. At the surface, this seems to be a somewhat innocent statement. Of course, what happens in Meereen is a prerequisite of Dany's struggle in Westeros as a logical continuation of her arc. That's basic storytelling. But, as is often the case with the analysis of Daenerys, there is something hidden deeper within this statement. This will become even more evident when we delve deeper into this part of the essay, but I believe that seasoned Dany extremists can already guess where this is going. Because the peace is framed as real, Dany's struggle concluding with her choosing to break it is a sign of the worst possible things to come. It is not stated directly in these essays, but the strong implication is there, as well as in another essay of his, Water Gardens and Blood Oranges. The impression I get is that Feldman implies that, according to him, Dany will burn the Water Gardens. I'm not 100% certain if Feldman originated this theory, or merely gave hints to it and other people popularize it, but the insinuation clearly is there. But George R. R. Martin did shut this theory down on Not a Blog, which is unusual given how his modus operandi with regards to fans asking about theories is always to say something like, well, maybe you're right, maybe you're wrong, keep reading. The Water Gardens used to be a very popular theory until George debunked it, after which everyone moved on to King's Landing and Wildfire, with some proposing 50-11 other places. Some still stay on the Water Gardens boat, believing that somehow George saying this is a confirmation. Well, it is confirmation. Confirmation bias in that case. All I'm saying is, if the theory was broadly correct, only the place of burning was different, the reaction would probably be different. Even if Feldman did not originate or popularize this theory, he does believe in the second dance of the dragons between Aegon and Daenerys, and he seems to believe that Dany rejecting the peace in Meereen is a prerequisite for Dany to give in to her worst impulses, specifically in her potential struggle with Aegon. This war between Dany and Aegon, or more broadly between Dany and Dorne, is framed as inevitable, and it will also inevitably end with Dany unleashing fire and blood onto innocents. According to these essays in Water Gardens, according to most of the fandom at this point, King's Landing. I used to believe in that as well, but as years passed, I became more and more skeptical about this whole second dance of the dragons. On one hand, George did say something about it, but then he mentioned that this second dance does not necessarily have to mean Dany's invasion. And if we look at it pragmatically, how would this even play out? In A Dance with Dragons, Aegon already landed in Westeros, and Arianne's sample chapters from The Winds of Winter show that she is already on her way to meet him. Meanwhile, Dany is still stranded on the Dothraki Sea, has to go to Vaes Dothrak, return to Meereen and sail west, with a stop in Volantis and maybe in Pentos. The only way for this to be the case is for Aegon to swiftly take King's Landing and wait for at least half a year for Dany's arrival to take her in battle. That also has to ignore the characters of Joncon and Cersei, whose presence in King's Landing is a recipe for a disaster of unreal proportions, though very few people seem to acknowledge it. Another thing about the Second Dance of the Dragons is that this particular war was not just called that because two Targaryen's claimants were involved, but because dragon fought dragon, they metaphorically dance in the sky. Contrary to some predictions, I don't think Aegon Blackfyre would be successful in stealing a dragon if Quentyn's precedent is to be believed. Then the dragons are loyal to her and her alone, and she will be the one to decide who else is going to ride them, unless Dragonbinder is involved. But that's another can of worms. Okay, let's end this digression. While Feldman does praise Dany's restraint and her efforts, ultimately the implication here is that they were all for nothing, because she decided that enough is enough, and because the peace was real, and the Harpy never sabotaged it, that has to be a mistake. Next, Feldman rightfully notes that Dany made a mistake to leave Astapor and marched forward without leaving a new, stable status quo. He also notes that even her staying in Meereen does not solve our problems, as Drogon kills Hazeya, which makes her question what she brought upon the world, and that the fear she has over whether she is mad is one of the reasons why she stayed in Meereen. He also notes that in the first draft of A Dance with Dragons, Dany thinks to herself that the only thing she fears is herself. Read from Dany entered Meereen as a violent conqueror to paraphrase earlier draft. Targaryen madness is a source of a lot of myths and misconceptions in the fandom. Company of the Cat, a channel that I wholeheartedly recommend, made a video where she excellently argues that the reason for Targaryen madness is the inability to interpret dragon dreams after the death of dragons, and that most crucially, Targaryen women are those ones who can interpret those dreams correctly, like Daenerys. And, that's a quite damning one, only men have ever succumbed to the true Targaryen madness: Aerion, Aerys, Baelor, Viserys. So if we assume what Company of the Cat says, it would be pretty peculiar for Dany to break that mold and become mad in spite of correctly interpreting her dreams and being a woman. But, of course, her deduction might turn out to be wrong, and it will happen nonetheless. Though I still find it weird that Dany's worries about her potential madness are so often used as proof that her succumbing to it is only a matter of time. Often, the thought she has in A Storm of Swords, "Am I mad? Do I have detained?" is used in those Mad Queen metas that point to her madness being imminent. But if you think about it for a second, people who are mad, mentally ill, or otherwise evil usually lack insight into their behavior. They do not believe themselves to be wrong, evil, mad, ill, etc. A common thing you see in mentally ill patients that have some sort of a psychosis is a belief that what they experience is 100% real. Truly evil people do not ruminate on their actions either. I, for one, doubt that Aerys ever had second thoughts about himself and his behavior. There are people in this series who commit terrible atrocities without as much as a single thought as to what that entails. And none ever are considered mad. Dany, on the other hand, endlessly ruminates about Hazeya, a single girl she didn't even know. So Dany fearing her darker side and fixating on whether she's mad should logically mean that she's certainly not mad. Adam Feldman, however, seems to be on board with the belief that if she questions herself and fears what she is capable of, she is doomed to embrace it sooner or later. I believe that Dany, being the only person to ever think about what consequences her actions have, stands out in the sea of characters who never do. In the eyes of many, that Dany even has moral struggles of this sort, and is the only character to ever reflect on them, means that the author and the narrative are condemning and scrutinizing her. Since nobody else has these sort of struggles, she stands out as an exception, and that, of course, needs to mean something. But once again, truly evil, mad, or dark people do not act like this. They engage in violence without thinking of the implications. Next, Adam Feldman lists some of Dany's darker actions, claiming that Dany is made of two sides, mother and dragon, and that the dragon side is capable of violence and cruelty when angered, giving the examples of the crucifixion, approving the torture of innocents to get more intel on the Sons of the Harpy, and taking hostages. From Dany has good reasons to fear herself, to darker side on Meereen. Let's preface this with the fact that I don't think there's two sides to Dany. First, because human beings are more complex than that. Second, because Dany's dragon and mother identities are explicitly linked together. We were given 3 instances of Dany choosing violence: crucifixion of slave owners, torturing of the wine seller's daughters, and taking hostages. That she does not hurt in any way, shape, or form, it must be added. All 3 have a common denominator. They were done in retaliation for the violence against others, With Aerys, we see that he engaged in cruel, terrible deeds, basically on a whim. For example, when he burned his mace and dagger hand, he did this to punish him for his resignation, so most likely for a personal slight. It was similar with Brandon and Rickard Stark. He also killed them because he could do it. But Dany does experience people personally slighting her, or otherwise getting on her nerves, and she never retaliates in the way Aerys would. There is a scene when an Astapori envoy spits on her, but all she says is that nobody has ever died of a bit of spit. If this was Aerys that was spat on, how do you think he would react? So, with that common denominator in mind, we can conclude that Dany's dragon and mother identities are connected because she only ever resorts to violence in defense of others, usually her metaphorical children. The crucifixion of the slave owners comes after they disemboweled and crucified slave children solely to taunt her. The torture of the wine seller's daughters comes after it was established that her and Sarit were poisoned at the wine shop, and the child hostages never get harmed, even if the harpy continues to rape, mutilate, and murder with impunity. A Song of Ice and Fire is a series that's full of senseless violence, and that violence is mostly done for one's own gain. As such, Daenerys, who only resorts to violence in defense of the most powerless elements of society, should be seen as a positive anomaly. We talk about a feudal world, where the lives of peasants and the lowest classes of society mean absolutely nothing, as reiterated by the innocent suffer when the mighty played their games of thrones. But ever since the very first book, Dany stands out as perhaps the only person playing the game who is concerned with collateral victims, even when she is completely powerless and risks a lot by doing so, as demonstrated in the village in the Lazar, contrary to what some other people claim. Later in that essay, Adam Feldman does bring up other characters who engage in violence against others, and we will discuss it at length. So what I'm about to say is not necessarily directed at him, but his statements made me realize something deeply sinister. People rarely condemn the violence done by other characters for their own gain and instead hyper-focus on Dany, so by singling her out as dark, evil and mad for being violent towards those who harm her people, knowingly or not, they imply that violence is fine so long as it's done for one's own benefit. Because why do we never hear that other characters have reasons to fear themselves? Jon Snow executed a man for not following an order. Jon is half Targaryen himself. He, too, should be at risk of having attained. And he's a man, so the likelihood of Targaryen madness is even higher for him. Yeah, I know, Phoenix Ashes with their whataboutism again. But even if we disregard Kat's theory about Targaryen madness being a man's exclusive thing, because women dreamers are the ones who can interpret what they see, and the grand subversion will be that Dany, a woman, succumbed to it, still, it is a fact that Dany never once used violence against anyone solely for her own gain, and yet, she is singled out as uniquely violent nonetheless. Not only that, Daenerys, and Targaryens more broadly, is the only character that is judged by 21st century standards, and that is most visible with the fact how much she is scrutinized for the use of torture. So, a little refresher. The Sons of the Harpy slaughtered several freedmen and Unsullied. 2 of them were poisoned at the wine shop. The owner of the shop either was behind it or allowed it to happen. Thus, he is a collaborator at best and a son of the Harpy at worst. At first, Dany merely wants to question him, but when she learns of the barbarity of the murders committed that night, she decides that the man will be questioned sharply. Skahas then suggests questioning the daughters of the wine seller as he watches. Dany agrees to it so long as she receives names. Afterwards, she realizes that the torture she asks Skahas to perform is bringing too many names, and as such, she stops it. The claim that Daenerys has a good reason to fear herself because she uses torture would make sense if she was the only character in this story to use torture, or if she was doing it out of sadistic pleasure. But as already established, that is not the case, because the use of torture is widely normalized in the society Dany lives in. Sure, it's not okay that it's used at all, but Dany is the only person in universe to use this torture as a way to find out who killed her people. And Dany is the only person to stop the torture once she concludes that it's not a reliable method of obtaining information, which is in stark contrast to everyone else who uses torture for that reason. And yet only Dany is singled out for the use of torture, because only Dany is analyzed by 21st century standard, and only Dany is considered as a foregone conclusion. In my video diving deeper into the Mad Queen Dany theory, I said it already. If you approach Dany with a preconceived notion that she is already mad and evil, or that her madness and evilness is certain to happen in the future, then of course you will apply such a double standard to her and her alone. The same applies to the crucifixion. As I already mentioned in the last part, the sackdown by Dani is always presented without necessary context. When those endless threats on Dani's future madness are created, you always have this specific scene in bold and italics, to really make it seem like she barged into a city just to sack it and crucify these people. When someone unfamiliar with the source material read that scene alone, they would indeed think that at best Dani is exceptionally violent, or at worst that she's crazy. But if you put it into context, that it is punishment for what they did first, that receives an entirely different dimension. Not to everyone, of course, but it does. And not to mention that Dani does not harm the hostages she took in any way, shape or form, and almost cries at the prospect. In short, Feldman, unfortunately, falls into the trap many other fans do, singling out Dani as uniquely violent in comparison to other characters, which simply does not have basis in reality, as well as condemning the actions of her and her alone using 21st century standards, without applying the same reasoning to everyone else. Next, Feldman discusses how Dani continuously chooses peace over violence. By chaining her dragons, which to him is also symbolically chaining her own violent impulses, as well as the refusal to kill the hostages, which is why the Mirinis changed their perception of her and aided peacemaking process. He mentions the initial conditions of marrying Hisdar, as well as Darius' insistence that she should round up the Mirinis and kill them all. While he mentions that she is appalled, he also makes sure to point out that his words linger in her mind. Read from How Dani Turns Away to Have Lingered in Her Mind. First, I disagree that Dani chaining her dragons is symbolically her chaining away her violent impulses. I believe it symbolizes her chaining herself, to Myrine, as well as chaining away her ideas and values, metaphorically enslaving herself. Secondly, there occurs another thing that happens almost exclusively when the character of Dani is discussed or analyzed. Dani's thoughts, that she does not act on in any way, shape or form, are scrutinized and used as proof that there is something not quite right with her. She is appalled at Darius' suggestion to slaughter the Mirinis nobility a la Red Wedding, but because she later has a passing thought where she remembers Darius' words, well, gotcha, she secretly wants to do it and has to take unimaginable restraint to not just organize something like this. Next, Feldman again says that peacemaking isn't easy and that you don't get everything you want, from will Dani follow to acceptance of the deal. Dani's Dance with Dragons chapters present not a slow and agonizing peacemaking process, but her making more and more concessions until she is cornered. Let's wait it. Slavers. Continuation of the slave trade in Yunkai, Astapor and the rest of Essos, meaning more unsullied and more child sex slaves. Hisdar with a substantial share of power in Myrine. Reopening of the fighting pits. Dani's supporters are removed from court. Dani. No slavery in Myrine. Dani started the entire campaign because she could not stand the treatment of Unsullied, but she has to give up even that. So in essence, all she would accomplish is just freedom in one city. The underlying system of oppression perpetuated in Essos would continue. And someone could say that Dani, being dissatisfied with such a turn of events, is solely because she set goals she could not accomplish, that the peace is for the benefit not only of her values, but to everyone else as well, that this is what her freedmen want as well. But she does not see it because we have no freedman POV. But the fact is, we do hear voices of the freedmen in other POVs. Daenerys Targaryen was wed. The guards on the pens had told them, laughing. She had taken a Myrine slaver as her king, as wealthy as he was noble. And when the peace was signed and sealed, the fighting pits of Myrine would open once again. Other slaves insisted that the guards were lying, that Daenerys Targaryen would never make peace with slavers. Misa, they called her. Someone told him that meant mother. Soon the Silver Queen would come forth from her city, smash the Yunkai, and break their chains, they whispered to one another. So the Yunkish slaves are in disbelief that Dani married Hisdar. They insist that Dani would never make peace with them and still hope to be rescued by her. If the freedmen do not want Dani to make peace, then who is this peace even for? Whom does it serve? The peace is supposed to be there for them, yet they are not satisfied by it. They outright do not believe that Dani made peace. So Dani rejecting that peace means something, that she eventually went the route that the freedmen want. Feldman then notes that Dani is forced into unpleasant concessions, and has people in her arc who tempt her to take a violent course of action. For example, Skahas, who wants the Myrini's nobility killed for participating in the blockade even when the killings stop, but she refuses even though she is unhappy. Feldman also notes that she has to restrain her wish to right every wrong in the world, as well as questioning whether she is being naive. And he also implies that Dani's actions in Astapor are because she used her power wrongly there. From but in them to it was my place to know. While Hisdar stopped the killings in Mirin, the Mirinis are still very clearly against her. Even Reznak and Hisdar's families participate in the blockade. I feel like this might be indicative of something. There are broadly two things I want to address from this paragraph. First, the assertion that Dany has to give up trying to right every wrong in the world. This strikes me as a way to diplomatically call Dany a bleeding heart, but maybe I dealt with way too many bad faith anti-Dany arguments and I grew cynical. In any case, this will become even more apparent as we go further in these essays. But so far, let's establish that, contrary to Feldman, I believe that while Dany cannot right every wrong in the world, because that is physically impossible, she has the means to right a lot of wrongs in the world that she lives in. But the method to achieve this is something he opposes. More on that later. And secondly, I will nitpick the way he criticizes Dany's actions in Astapor, because those do not come from her misusing her power. It's not like she barged there and sacked them for her own benefit. When she entered Astapor, she essentially did not have any power. She did have dragons, but those were too tiny to be an actual military threat. So did she have any power to misuse? Astapor turned out the way it did, not because Dany waged some war on innocent people, but because she did not leave behind anything that could enforce her new order. This wasn't her misusing power and acknowledging it. It's her realizing that she failed to properly stabilize the place. She mentions Irohe because, in a way, the same mechanism was at play in Astapor. She wanted to help, but in the end, she made the situation worse because she did not think of the consequences. Next comes a long segment that I do not have any comments for, but have to be read to understand later parts of the essay. Feldman notes that Dany refuses to let the dragons loose on Yunkai in spite of what Plum suggests. She also does not send Unsullied to not lose grip on the city, and she realizes that she can only move forward by marrying Hisdar, even though it's distressing for her. He then mentions her tending to the refugees and having a passing thought about the Mirinis red wedding Dario suggested. Dany then has another temptation in the form of Dario, learns of Brown Ben Plum's betrayal, and the necessity to close the gates to the Astapori refugees. Read from, meanwhile, the Yungish are approaching, to Dario remain. Later, Feldman mentions that Dany entering an affair with Dario might sabotage the peace, and symbolizes how she's attracted to the easier path of war, which he promises to elaborate on later. Dany gives Dario up, but before her wedding, Quentyn arrives and gives her one last temptation. Dany, however, shelves her ambitions for Westeros for the time being. He then once more lists all the things she sacrifices, and concludes this with a very strange statement. And if Dany's arc in the book ended with her marriage, it would be the story of how she summoned the immense courage and self-restraint to make those sacrifices. But her arc doesn't end here. Read from, Dany then begins her affair, to that statement. It's specifically the word would here that makes this statement peculiar. Because do all the things he mentioned not mean that Dany already has shown courage and self-restraint? It's like all of this does not ultimately matter to Feldman because he already has a certain prediction for her, and he takes that prediction as 100% confirmed. In a way, he once more falls into the same trap as Mad Queen theorists. Because he looks at her story with preconceived conclusions, strange statements such as this one will be its side effect. Dany did unquestionably summon immense courage and self-restraint to make those sacrifices, objectively, and that she eventually realizes that this is not the way about it does not invalidate it, especially because she's currently stranded on the Dothraki Sea, and all we have is speculations. It has long been speculated that every single character will be at their darkest in the Winds of Winter. But while, for example, Jon's potential darker turn is anticipated, Dany's is heavily scrutinized and singled out as something to be uniquely afraid of. This part of the essay will be about Dany's rejection of the concessions she made because she knew that unleashing her violent side caused only devastation. Read from In ADWD to It was a failure and mistake. Now, the part about unleashing a violent side in the past having violent consequences is certainly puzzling. We already discussed it. The sack of Astapor was indeed violent, but it ultimately was a short-term violence that only turned into something more horrifying upon Dany's departure, since she failed to stabilize the situation enough and did not predict that leaving 3 people in charge will end in such violence. Hazeya is also hardly a result of Dany's violent side. It's not like she ordered Drogon to kill a child. Next, Feldman notes that George has always been preoccupied with showing that war is not glorious. He does note that he is not a total pacifist, and that he seems to believe that war is fine in self-defense or to win against some greater evil. Yet that nonetheless, most wars sound good in theory but are bad in practice. He mentions how some good feel moments of warmongering, such as Rob's crowning and Daenerys Dracarys in Astapor, are almost immediately undercut with horrific consequences of thereof, from before we get to their Game of Thrones. Mentioning the aftermath of Rob's war is certainly worth praising, since it is exceptionally rare, but I find it weird how Daenerys' War of Liberation in Slaver's Bay is framed in the same way. Why is Daenerys Dracarys' moment in Astapor framed as innocents who suffer most when the High Lords play their Game of Thrones, when this isn't Dany playing the Game of Thrones? Quite the opposite, in fact. Dany wanted to purchase an army for her Game of Thrones, but rather than do it, she made an attempt to liberate the masses of Slaver's Bay. Did she make mistakes along the way? Sure, but Daenerys Dracarys' moment sparked something that I believe is already far bigger than her. Once more, what happened in Astapor after Dany's departure wasn't an aftermath of war. It was her lack of insight into what she should do to stabilize the place enough. And she is well aware of this. That's why she stayed in Meereen in the first place. Feldman does mention that according to George, there are wars worth fighting, especially if it's self-defense or against evil. And war against slavery is both. It's self-defense for enslaved masses and against evil. I've been a firm believer that Dany's campaign in Slaver's Bay is one big foreshadowing of her fight against the others, contrary to people insinuating that she won't take part in it. We may endlessly dwell on the aftermath of wars, but fact for the matter is, the status quo in Slaver's Bay wasn't all that better, even though it technically was not at war. The insight we get into how Astapor creates the Unsullied is one of the most horrifying things in this story, where many horrifying things happen. Thousands of innocent children are kidnapped from their homes, castrated and dehumanized. They endure years of torture. They are forced to strangle dogs and kill babies. But because Feldman equates Dany's actions in Slaver's Bay with Rob's entirely self-serving war for kinghood, he does not seem to see Dany's war as righteous or worth fighting for. George himself seems to disagree. I never held much with slavery. You can't just go, using another kind of people, like they wasn't people at all. Know what I mean? Got to end sooner or later. Better if it ends peaceful, but it's got to end, even if it has to be with fire and blood, you see? Maybe that's what them abolitionists been saying all along. You try to be reasonable, that's only right, but if it don't work, you got to be ready. Some things is just wrong. They got to be ended. Innocents already died and will die in that war of liberation, because every revolution in history was bloody, and innocents died. And what's most important about it, people who are subjugated and oppressed are willing to die for their liberation. The priest is calling on the Volantines to go to war, the Half-Maester told him. But on the side of right, as soldiers of the Lord of Light, R'hllor who made the sun and stars and fights eternally against the darkness. Niessus and Malako have turned away from the light, he says, their hearts darkened by the yellow harpies from the east. He says, dragons. I understood that word. He said dragons. Aye, the dragons have come to carry her to glory. Her, Daenerys? Haldon nodded. Benerol has sent forth the word from Volantis. Her coming is the fulfillment of an ancient prophecy. From smoke and salt was she born to make the world anew. She is Azor Ahai returned, and her triumph over darkness will bring a summer that will never end. Death itself will bend its knee, and all those who died fighting in her cause shall be reborn. Before anyone accuses me of believing unreliable narrators, Daenerys has no idea that the Red Temple in Volantis proclaimed her Azor Ahai. She does not know who Azor Ahai is, and this is from Tyrion's POV, and earlier he notes that most of those who listen are slaves. So the slaves are ready to die for Dany and their own liberation. They quite literally want Dany to deal with their oppressors with fire and blood. They borderline worship Dany, in spite of her mistakes, and none hold them against her. Of course, innocents will die in the upcoming war, but is it not a net positive after all, given how violent was the status quo? If we clutched our pelts at every innocent death, we would close ourselves at our homes and never fight for anything. Irrespective of all this, Feldman still believes that peace is preferable, that we should not have an idealized view of peace, and that war is an easy choice, and that Martin does view the peace as valuable and worthwhile. From after dwelling on war to the price of peace is too high. The words about peace being depelled beyond the price are spoken by someone who, most likely, ordered murders, mutilation and rape of what must be tens, if not hundreds of innocent people. We once again circle back to Barristan. I discussed this in part 1, but here I will reiterate that Barristan's arc is all about overcoming his passivity, and if he had no right to break the peace, he would be vindicated in that passivity. I seriously question whether George sees this peace as worthwhile or valuable. I firmly believe that this peace is absolutely worthless, and that it was a mistake to try and compromise with the slavers. And I already outlined why, and why I think it's impossible for them to have any goodwill towards Daenerys. Feldman does reiterate that wars can be well-meaning, and not all of them are started by wicked people. But he still seems to believe that peace is always more desirable than war, even if it's a war of liberation, as seen here. Again, it feels to me like he would rather have Dany accept slavery, like Xaro urges her to, since to him, the alternative, liberation via short-term wartime violence, is not worth it, no matter what. Yet the freedmen do not seem to share this view. They are ready to die for their freedom. Next, Feldman says that Dany knows the consequences of war, and that's why she chose peace, but that peace is not idyllic, and she is deeply dissatisfied with it. He also says that Dany essentially has to accept some injustices. From why Dany becomes dissatisfied with peace to she drank another cup of wine to wash it out. To call that peace not idyllic and not happily ever after is an understatement. I really don't think a lot has been achieved at all, and Dany knows it, hence her constant gloomy mood. And as we know from Tyrion's POV, the freedmen are in disbelief and can't accept that Dany abandoned them, and the Yunkai are shown to rub it into her face that they essentially won. It's very convenient to shrug off that the pyramid acrobatic show featuring a little naked girl at the top as Dany merely being paranoid. And it could be that, if it wasn't that it's not the only display of mockery directed towards her. Yunkai trade in slaves within sight of Dany's walls and also taunts Dany with the slave performers. I think that they are mocking her. Then I want to show you this statement of his. And she finds that she loathes allowing injustice to continue when peace necessarily involves letting injustices continue. First, this isn't just injustice. It's slavery in Yunkai, and Yunkai openly rubbing it into her face. To call it injustice is a peculiar understatement. And once more, we must remember that Feldman is so staunchly anti-war that I feel like it blinded him to the reality of the situation to some degree. Because accepting injustice as a part of peace was what allowed slavery to fester. Like I said, Astapor was not at war when it was creating Unsullied. So, is the existence of slavery, euphemistically called injustice, preferable to the war of liberation where innocents die? Are the boys kidnapped from their homes and castrated not innocent? Some injustices in the world will always exist, but allowing the slave trade in Yunkai and Astapor, as well as the rest of Essos, is not injustice. It's allowing the inhumane system she wanted to destroy to continue. Next, Feldman references two scenes. One, when the Palakin bearer is given aid, and when Hizdar tells Dany that only adults are allowed to participate in the fighting pits. He says that even though these are objective improvements, Dany has trouble seeing them as such. The only comment I have for that is that I don't think this is true. Let's read those passages out loud. Those bearers were slaves before I came. I made them free. Yet the palanquin is no lighter. True, said Hizdar, but those men are paid to bear its weight now. Before you came, that man who fell would have an overseer standing over him, stripping the skin off his back with a whip. Instead, he is being given aid. It was true. A brazen beast in a boar mask had offered the litter bearer a skin of water. I suppose I must be thankful for small victories, the queen said. One step, then the next, and soon we shall be running. Together we shall make a new Meereen. 6 and 10, Hizdar insisted. A man grown, who freely chose to risk his life for gold and glory. No children die today in Daznax, as my gentle queen in her wisdom has decreed. Another small victory. Perhaps I cannot make my people good, she told herself. But I should at least try to make them a little less bad. It's Dany who says that she must be thankful for small victories, and Dany who thinks that children not dying in the pits is a small victory. So she does acknowledge it. As such, it's simply not true that she has trouble accepting it. I think it's the opposite. Deep inside she hates the peace, but tries to convince herself that she did the right thing. Next, Feldman brings up a scene where Dany clashes with Hizdar over Penny and Tyrion in the pit, and that this is the way she ought to deal with injustices, peacefully. I already mentioned that Penny and Tyrion being in the pit is a not so subtle hint that there is something wrong with that piece. And it's once again strange to call this situation just injustice. It's two enslaved people almost being ripped apart by lions to entertain the slaving elites. Imagine if Dany was not present in the pit. What would have happened then? How many of such injustices are happening all over Meereen without Dany knowing about them? And if the slaving elite sees Dany react to those injustices peacefully, then what is stopping them from breaking more and more boundaries, or perhaps even trying to overthrow her, since they see her as weak? We focus on the innocents, but weren't Tyrion and Penny precisely innocents, who could have been slaughtered if it wasn't for Dany's intervention? Later, Feldman insinuates that Dany, due to her unhappiness, flirts with breaking the peace in two ways. She wants Brown Ben Plum killed and shows the dragons to Quentyn, from "for all these reasons" to "smoke and fire." Once more, I fail to see how these two actions are flirting with breaking the peace. If Ben was to be removed and replaced by someone that would be loyal to Dany, it would certainly be an advantage, since more military power means more people able to enforce that precious peace. I also believe that Dany showing Quentyn the dragons was sooner about testing Quentyn rather than her flirting with breaking the peace. There is a segment in that conversation where Dany says that maybe her marriage isn't the end of Quentyn's hopes, and I think that she does consider taking a second husband in the future. This might be the reason why she showed him the dragons. Next, we move on to the fighting pits. Feldman thinks that Dany's and Barristan's distaste for the fighting pits may be a matter of cultural relativism, since everyone in Meereen wants them reopened. From "the fighting pits are a symbol" to "she had as much right to risk her life as any man." That these former slaves begged Dany to be able to fight in the pits is not proof that the fighting pits are not so bad after all. It is proof of how dehumanizing it is to be a slave in Essos. Gogor says that he killed someone for the first time when he was 6 years old. Could a 3-year-old consent to being trained as a gladiator? Could a 6-year-old consent to fight in the pits and kill people? It's normal for slaves to internalize their predicament. That does not mean that it's suddenly good. Tyrion says in his chapters, "The most insidious thing about bondage was how easy it was to grow accustomed to it." I'm going to spoil the show Spartacus now, so if you don't want to be spoiled, skip to this timestamp. The show Spartacus is precisely about people enslaved to be gladiators. While the show is a bit campy and overdramatic at times, one of the things it did excellently was how it portrayed the complex psychological outlook on that enslavement, as exemplified by 3 different characters. Spartacus gets enslaved and his wife taken away from him, and he is bought by Batiatus, who wants to make a gladiator out of him. He initially resents the training and his owners, but his raw talent prompts his owner to promise that, if he does well, he will make efforts to get his wife back. He gains new motivation, and while Batiatus does get Sura back, he arranges it so that she is murdered right before she returns to Spartacus. Spartacus' reaction to all that is to sort of give up on everything else and embrace his life as a gladiator. That's an incredibly human and understandable psychological response, though eventually he snaps out of it, with fire and blood. Another character is Crixus, who, throughout the first season, is framed as an antagonist to Spartacus. Since he was the best of the best before his arrival, he resents Spartacus for taking his spot. From the very beginning, Crixus relishes in his life as a gladiator, but he does have a more vulnerable side to him, as he falls in love with the servant of Batiatus' wife, Naivia. Problem is, Batiatus' wife Lucretia has her eyes on Crixus himself, so this affair is a forbidden love sort of thing. When Lucretia finds out, both are harshly punished, and only this convinces Crixus to join Spartacus' rebellion. The arena was Crixus' life, and only a series of personal tragedies snapped him out of it. A third character to undergo such a journey is Gannicus. Like Spartacus, he was a gladiator, but won his freedom and later joined Spartacus' rebellion, though he is initially critical of it. By the end of the show, Gannicus gets captured and crucified, and as he dies, he hallucinates that he is back at the arena, greeted and cheered by many. He then smiles. Psychologically, this makes sense. That he enjoyed the glory of the arena does not mean that he was not subjugated. It's the same with the fighters of the pit in Meereen. They do derive happiness and fulfillment from it, but it does not mean that it's ultimately good for them. And if we're being totally honest here, this is all they know, so of course they would advocate for it. Then we discuss how Dany rejigs the Meereenese by taking off her tokar right as Drogon appears. The cultural script shifts, now it's the Meereenese who are horrified. Dany faces Drogon and flies away. Drogon's arrival is certainly not a coincidence. But in my eyes, it's different from Feldman's assertions. Drogon arrives just in time to snap Dany out of the delusions of compromising with the Myrines. Drogon has already been an agent against slavery during a situation with Krasness. In a world where dragons were, for hundreds of years, used for the purposes of enslavement, a dragon standing against it is certainly something interesting. That the Myrines only get outraged, disgusted and horrified when Drogon starts eating Barsena is meant to show their utter hypocrisy. Up to this point, they had no problem relishing in the violence, but they are disgusted and scared when the agent of that violence is a dragon, and not those they subjugated. And when Drogon begins his carnage, whom does he target? All of a sudden, it's the overlookers of the pit and the slave masters that are being slaughtered on the pit. Now, Phoenix, how can you know this? I've seen video essays where I heard that they killed hundreds of innocent people. You can deduce it from what the slaves say later about the carnage. Because the best seats, those at the bottom of the pit, were reserved for the most affluent, so closest to Drogon. I know what I saw, an old slave in a rusted iron collar was saying, and I saw that dragon ripping off arms and legs, tearing men in half, burning them down to ash and bones. People started running, trying to get out of that pit, but I come to see a show, and by all the gods of Gis I saw 'em. I was up in the purple, so I didn't think the dragon was like to trouble me. So Drogon reversed the roles. The slave masters relished in the violence done to the former slaves, and now the slaves relished in the deaths of their oppressors. In Barristan's chapters, we hear of a man called Harkas, who tried to kill Drogon. When he is called the hero, a freedman attacks the person who brought him up. And when a man in the blue and gold tokar began to speak of Harkas the hero, a freedman behind him shoved him to the floor. It took 6 brazen beasts to pull them apart and drag them from the hall. So the freedmen hate Harkas, the youngish slave stayed behind to look at the carnage, and at the very least the majority of those killed by Drogon in Daznak's pit were slavers. Really makes you think. Feldman then discusses Dany's mental state on the Dothraki Sea, believing that Drogon not wanting to take Dany back to Meereen is symbolic of her dragon side keeping her away from the peace, and the visions or hallucinations she has all criticize her for her actions in Meereen. Dany forgets Hazia's name, which symbolizes her rejection of concern for an innocent life. Dany's breaking point towards the rejection of peace is seemingly her distaste for the Meereenese culture, not injustice per se, and that she now sees staying in Meereen as something she did more on a whim. She rejects Meereen, embraces fire and blood, and goes on a darker path. Up to this point, Dany's violence has only been directed towards cartoonishly evil slavers, but having the mindset of fire and blood and going to Westeros, where there are no evil slavers, is significant. This is a very long excerpt, but it works as a coherent whole, so read it all, and I will analyze it in full, paragraph by paragraph. Read from Removed from the City to War Felt Better for Her. First thing I want to address is that while Viserys and Jorah are clearly hallucinations, and it's Dany's own psyche speaking to her while taking their form, I believe that Quaithe really did appear in front of Dany, just like she would appear in front of her periodically ever since A Clash of Kings. Quaithe is a somewhat ambiguous figure in Dany's arc. We can't be sure if she's an ally or a foe, but I mention this because I think it's significant that we have an outsider being critical of Dany lingering in Meereen. Another mistake is this sentence. The clear suggestion being that Dany needs to abandon or seriously reduce her concern for innocent life, in favor of using her own dragon power to do what she wants. In spite of how the show portrayed her and how the fanon portrays her, unfortunately including this essay, Dany is not an inherently cruel or violent person, nor are the Targaryens for the matter, and her restraint during these 10 chapters proves it. But what I dislike about the statement the most is that Dany's campaigns in Slaver's Bay, both its more peaceful and violent parts, are not because she wants to be a conqueror, nor do I think that she does inherently want to use draconic power to get what she wants. The core of Daenerys' character is that she sees all of the things she does out of a sense of duty, not unlike her brother Rhaegar. I know people hate when I remind them that at this point Daenerys is 15-16, but you do see her age shine through her internal monologue. Mostly through her silly crush on Daario, but also because the essence of her is just a normal girl who wants a normal life, but was essentially catapulted into being the last remaining member of her house who feels an immense sense of duty to reclaim the throne, installed by none other than Viserys. Yet, when she arrives at Slaver's Bay and sees the unimaginable suffering there, something makes her pivot. That is because Dany has a view that, as someone with a position of power and authority, she has a duty to protect her subjects. I was alone for a long time, Jorah, all alone but for my brother. I was such a small scared thing. Viserys should have protected me, but instead he hurt me and scared me worse. He shouldn't have done that. He wasn't just my brother, he was my king. Why do the gods make kings and queens, if not to protect the ones who can't protect themselves? The sun was climbing up the sky, and her people would soon be gathering. She would rather have drifted in the fragrant pools all day, eating ice fruit off silver trays, and dreaming of the house with the red door. But the queen belongs to her people, not to herself. That's why I believe that framing this in terms of Dany wants to use draconic power to get what she wants is incorrect, because she wants a house with the red door and a simple life. Dany will use draconic power because she realized that these peacemaking efforts were indeed in vain. Dany is going to continue on the same path as before, engaging in violence in defense of other people, only this time she won't fear using dragons as well. Another thing I want to mention is that people make a big deal out of Dany forgetting Hazia's name. While indeed it may be symbolic of her making certain choices regarding collaterals, I also don't believe that someone who is meant to be this quite dark character would follow her forgetting a girl's name with a lament that she herself will never have a little girl. These aren't words of a terrible future villain. Framing Dany's distaste for the Myrini's culture, rather than injustice as a whole, as her final straw, also serves to reinforce the idea that choosing fire and blood is ultimately a mistake. Frames Dany's decision as not entirely honest and a bit self-serving, as does the insistence that she stayed in Meereen because it was her whim as a young girl. While Dany's decision to stay in Meereen to avoid it turning into Astapor is not mentioned in the passage cited by Feldman, another thing is that after she departed from Yunkai and Astapor, thousands of freedmen followed her, and she needed to conquer Meereen to feed them, not wanting to leave them behind to their fates. And while Dany does not explicitly mention it here, it is an undisputed fact that she stayed behind to avoid Meereen turning into Astapor. Here Dany also expresses her weariness of her duties as queen, because fundamentally, planting trees and seeing them grow is what she wants. AKA, she wants to live a simple life, but as a queen, she belongs to her people, not to herself. And queenship also requires fire and blood. Here we have the central theme of A Song of Ice and Fire, human heart in the conflict with itself. I now understand why the peace in Meereen was framed as real this entire time, to show Dany's rejection of thereof, not only as a mistake, but also something she did basically on a whim, and not because there was demonstrable evidence that this peace failed. An incredible amount of goodwill was given to the Meereenese slavers, while Dany's dissatisfaction with the peace she achieved is framed as just her unreliable narration, and it's not as bad as she thinks after all. I also don't think it's a coincidence that the preferable outcome for Daenerys would be to stay in Meereen. I will not elaborate on that. If you know, you know. The insistence that Daenerys rejected the peace and gave in to her violent impulses solely because she wants it, because war feels better for her, I'm sorry to say, is a severe mischaracterization of her character and her motivations. To me, this has always been Dany's realization that her efforts at peacemaking have, at large, been futile and led nowhere, and that only the path of war can, ironically, lead to lasting peace. She learns her lessons, and in spite of what these essays seem to insinuate, it won't be her returning to her Khal-like ways in future endeavors. I think Dany understood what Aegon the Conqueror did, that you can give a place fire and blood, and then years of peace and prosperity. Helps that she is being compared to him so often. So no, this isn't Dany achieving peace and then deciding that war feels better. It's her realizing the futility of her actions, because fundamentally this is what this has always been about. Dany realizing that you can't stop your revolution halfway, that there will be collaterals, but that it is preferable to the sort of peace and status quo where the worst atrocities are done in everyday life, where they might not be active war, but people are still raped, tortured, mutilated, treated like cattle, and dehumanized. While there is no slavery in Westeros, even Tyrion notes that the lives of peasants are not that different from slaves. Dany won't burn the Water Gardens or King's Landing or whatever it is this week, and that the claim of the second Dance of the Dragons looks more and more nebulous with each passing day. Essentially, I feel like the problem with this segment of the essay is that it took the assumption of what Dany is about to do and analyzed Meereen's arc from that angle, which colored it to a substantial degree. Dany can't linger in Meereen and make compromises for years and years and years, because it makes her stagnate. The only way she can truly leave Meereen is to leave no slave owner behind, so that slavery can never return. And the revolution she sparked isn't limited to Slaver's Bay either. She can negotiate and compromise endlessly against virtually everyone in Essos. Fire and blood is the answer, the only answer in this particular situation, even if it meant the deaths of innocents. Sometimes, war is preferable to a false peace. The very last thing I want to address is the conclusion bit, where Feldman makes the mistake many other theorists do, assuming that George is obsessed with tricking the audience. We were fooled and misled by unreliable narrator and POV bias, and while every character is unreliable, that unreliability won't be the same for everyone. I want to remind you that only one character was called unreliable by name. It wasn't Danny. This isn't George's modus operandi, never was. He isn't obsessed with pulling the rug from beneath our feet. Most of the time, his foreshadowing is straightforward, and the narrative is also straightforward. Those who pay attention always see what is coming. I think things in Meereen are exactly as they seem, and those many strange holes in the piece, the slave trade in Astapor and Yunkai, Penny and Tyrion almost being killed, cannot be explained by unreliable narration. And remember, the second dance of the dragons does not have to mean Danny's invasion. Last part of the essay is a comparison and contrast between Daario and Hizdahr as Danny's love interests and what they may symbolize. I wondered if I should skip this part, but there's one interesting thing about the arguments Feldman makes, so I will instead focus on it. In this particular instance, we will analyze it as a coherent whole, so read it all. I think that there is no hidden meaning in Danny's choices of consorts, and I don't think they symbolize anything, other than maybe the fact that Danny is just a teenager. The assumption that there has to be something deeper here, maybe because it's unusual to have male characters be this subordinate to female characters as nothing more than love interests. But I think it's simply a choice between being with someone she wants versus doing her duty. We will ignore Daario altogether, and we will instead analyze Hizdahr's Zalorak. I have the impression that the assumption that Hizdahr means peace is quite symbolic in how Feldman views peace in Meereen. Namely, rather than representing true peace, Hizdahr represents the violence of the status quo, and how one might be lulled into a false belief that this is preferable to open war. It's hard to see the true nature of Hizdahr. He's handsome, well-spoken, and comes across as quite charming. But there is something disturbing, even sinister in that guy. For one, when Danny closes the fighting pits, he buys them all and then insists on reopening them. A very ruthless move that would, however, bring a lot of revenue if they were to be reopened. Another disturbing thing is that he violates Danny sexually. The excitement of the day had inflamed her husband's passions. No sooner had her handmaids retired for the night than he tore the rope from her and tumbled her backwards into bed. Danny set her arms around him and let him have his way. Drunk as he was, she knew he would not be inside her long. Nor was he. Afterwards, he nuzzled at her ear and whispered, "Gods grant that we have made a son tonight." When Danny leaves the city, Hizdahr rapes a bed slave. Only you can answer that magnificence. It might be that you wish to put another woman in her place. Sir Barristan nodded at the girl, peering timidly from the bedchamber. That one, perhaps? The king looked around wildly. Her? She's nothing. A bed slave. He raised his hands. I misspoke. Not a slave. A free woman. Trained in pleasure. Even a king has needs. She is none of your concern, sir. I would never harm Daenerys. Never. His reaction is that of someone caught red-handed, and the Freudian slip only highlights it. Danny's marriage to Hizdahr is symbolically linked to slavery. 4 hours later, they emerge again as man and wife, bound together wrist and ankle with chains of yellow gold. Hizdahr also seems to be a sadist, since he is excited at the prospect of Penny and Tyrion dying. The battle was followed by the day's first folly, a tilt between a pair of jousting dwarfs, presented by one of the Yunkish lords that Hizdahr had invited to the games. One rode a hound, the other a sow. Their wooden armor had been freshly painted, so one bore the stag of the usurper Robert Baratheon, the other the golden lion of House Lannister. That was for her sake, plainly. Their antics soon had Belva's snorting laughter, though Danny's smile was faint and forced. When the dwarf in red tumbled from the saddle and began to chase his sow across the sands, Willis, the dwarf on the dog, galloped after him, whopping at his buttocks with a wooden sword. She said, "This is sweet and silly, but—" "Be patient, my sweet," said Hizdahr. "They are about to lose the lions." Daenerys gave him a quizzical look. "Lions? 3 of them. The dwarves will not expect them." She frowned. "The dwarves have wooden swords, wooden armor. How do you expect them to fight lions?" "Badly," said Hizdahr. "Though perhaps they will surprise us. More like they will shriek and run about and try to climb out of the pit. That is what makes this folly." Danny was not pleased. "I forbid it. Gentle queen, you do not want to disappoint your people. You swore to me that the fighters would be ground men who had freely consented to risk their lives for gold and honor." These dwarfs did not consent to battle lions with wooden swords. You will stop it, now. The king's mouth tightened. For a heartbeat, Dany thought she saw a flash of anger in those placid eyes. As you command, Hisdar became to his pitmaster. No lions, he said when the man trotted over, whip in hand. When Drogon lands on Daznak's pit and Hisdar witnesses him eating Barsena, this is his reaction. Oh gods, moaned Reznak. He's eating her. The seneschal covered his mouth. Strong Balbas was retching noisily. A queer look passed across Hisdar Zolorak's long, pale face. Part fear, part lust, part rapture. He licked his lips. Hisdar represents both the new and the old status quo in Slaver's Bay. He represents people slaughtered in the fighting pits and the Yunkish and Astapori getting re-enslaved. He represents Dany compromising about everything to avoid war. But at the same time, he's a charming, good-looking guy, seemingly a voice of reason, someone who often advises Dany in what seems to be good faith. Seemingly at peace, but deep inside him there is something dark. He is a sadist and a rapist. Outwardly, he might seem better than total war and poor innocents dying, but deep inside, the violence he engages in is just as terrible, only it's adorned in better clothes. It's done within the safety of what the Mirinis consider acceptable. Hisdar is the way Astapor was when Dany first arrived there. Peaceful, but built on the blood of slaves. I read and reread those essays a lot while doing this video. My overall judgment on them is that I think the farther they go, the worse the quality of the arguments. I think that the first two parts of the essays argue their points fairly well, even if I overall disagree with the conclusions they make or some of the points. But it seems like they sort of go downhill with part 3 and 4, and that part 5 is wholly unnecessary. In recent times, I saw more and more people being critical of these essays, and I think that their biggest problem is that they simply aged badly. It's been a decade since they were first published, and they were the first in-depth analysis of Dany's arc. So many people cling to them so that they don't have to think about Meereen themselves. To this day, this storyline receives virtually no discussion, aside from searching for clues to Dany's upcoming downfall, even though there is a lot to appreciate there, especially uncovering the entire intrigue. My impression is that Adam Feldman did not necessarily want to untangle the knot, but to connect Dany's arc to potential future developments of the story and argue in favor of his belief that the piece was real. I'm not 100% sure if that's it, it's just the impression I got. I think that every part of this essay serves to reinforce it, even the part about Skahas poisoning the locusts, because that would make the piece real, Barristan breaking it unjustified, and Dany unleashing fire and blood also unjustified. But the assumption that the piece was real essentially renders Dany's and Barristan's arc null and void. Dany's efforts in Meereen should precisely be seen as futile work, because slavery is not something you can or should compromise with. You can't reform it away. The solution has always been to give them fire and blood. The mistake in Meereen is that Dany was still a naive girl who hoped that she could make things work with goodwill alone. But that does not mean her efforts were pointless. They taught her a lot about ruling and, contrary to popular belief, proved that she is a good queen. And after you try all possible options and your enemy still spits in your face, what should you do? Give up even more and then keep compromising. Give somebody an inch and they will take a yard. No, the Harpy did not intend to keep the peace in the long term. No, the Harpy did not have good intentions. No, the Harpy was not willing to compromise with Dany. And yes, fire and blood is the only answer. Fire and blood was the only answer in every revolution. And every revolution that stopped halfway eventually failed. I think that at times Feldman is even comically anti-war. He does mention that even George believes that there are some wars that are justified, and certainly a war to end a continent-wide institution of slavery would be such a war in the eyes of what I assume is most people, but apparently not to him, since he reiterates time and time again that peace is preferable in this particular instance, a peace that creates pathologies that can be explained away by unreliable narration. Dany's war in Slaver's Bay is not her conquering cities because she wants their wealth or glory, but because she wants to liberate its people. And when the people themselves want it and are prepared to die for their liberation, then what is the point of keeping the peace? Unfortunately, Feldman is one of the people who treat Dany as a foregone conclusion. Like I said, I think he has a certain trajectory for her in mind and wants to connect it to what she does in Slaver's Bay. It won't make a lot of sense to say that Dany will slaughter innocents in her selfish war against Aegon if her decision to break the peace was not framed as a mistake and something she had no right to do. But the certain thesis of my response to these essays is exactly that. the peace was not real. Maybe it's my own bias speaking, but I really don't think it's possible for George to approve this essay wholly, while so much of his own text seems to speak against it. What is unfortunate, however, is that George has a tendency to both side a lot of his conflicts, and I fear that he may go this way here if we ever get The Winds of Winter. Overall, I think that Danes A Dance with Dragons arc is not only about the futility of her actions. I think that it's a series of tests for her. Tests that she responds to in a way that proves that she is a capable ruler, that puts her people first, but that also she has to reckon with the fact that if she wants peace, she has to go to war. And lastly, dragons do plant trees. Thanks for watching. Remember that if you like my content, like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video.